Hello world of YouTube and welcome to the listening log update for April of 2025. I've got 10 new albums that I spun over the last month that I'm going to talk about in this video with time codes listed in the description for each individual review if you'd like to skip around in the video. I didn't get to any requests that may be lingering in the ether this past month because April was dense with releases on both sides and my middle of the month was dense in its own personal way. I like a decent amount of what I spun over the last month, and I'm excited to tell you my thoughts on these albums. So give it a like if you're excited, and let's go ahead and get started by talking about... While not maybe completely, I think a big percentage of why one can get enjoyment from this Skrillex April Fool's release, fuck you Skrillex, you think you ain't a Worhol, but you're not, is derived from how into the bit this album is playing You Are Into. And I am pretty into this bit. This album takes some of the sort of postmodern and self-aware ideas that Skrillex kind of wove throughout parts of his artistry, even during his bro step era, but was also kind of brought out in pockets of records like Recess and his last two album Duology that I liked more of than I didn't, but cranks that up beyond the places he's ever tried to dive into before. It is an album that is constructed with a hodgepodge of ideas that are just woven together so well. It kind of gives more like Aesop Rock's The Blob than it does like any other Skrillex release. But I'm kind of into what this approach kind of brings to the surface. You know, it's got some moments that honestly are pretty hype amidst some of the moments that genuinely made me laugh. Like, I thought that the fucking Navi sample in Tears Lost Drop was hilarious, but that song still goes hard. And the Shadow Wizard Money Gang and Nuke Radio samples that he also has in some of the earlier pockets of the record just add to the sort of irony that this record is trying to radiate with. But even as the record goes on, and given that this album has some of the collaborators that he had brought out that he had worked together with during those last two records, it adds to the artistry beneath a lot of that, you know, meme-y type shit that this album does have cooking throughout its especially first stretch. Hold On is literally just like a drop made into its own part of the track listing. It's a solid drop, but like this record really does go the distance on being probably the most self-aware dubstep album to exist. Equally so, DMB Ting is the kind of lull drum and bass YouTube outro ass interlude that like would sell on a record in like 2013, but has a whole different meaning within the context of this project that I just adore. But the fact that he's also got like once thought lost Skrillex gems finally kind of being on general DSPs on this release really shows to the sort of care he's wanting to put into a project that he is just kind of throwing out there on April Fool's Day. There's also some other moments where like he's bringing out those sonics outside of just working with the collaborators from records like Quest for Fire and giving them more life and expansions. You know, I fucking love the Dylan Brady two-piece that pops up in the back half. I think that the two of them's production ideas and just sonics work well together. I also really love some of the more melodic stuff, like the Eurohead collaboration, See You Again, and Koraboo. I think that the more producer-focused stuff, like Gula BB and Look at You, are also really nice moments where it feels like a crock pot of artists underneath this sort of symbolic figurehead, so to speak. And I really like that about this. This is a record that, like, I didn't know how into the bit I was gonna be, because I looked at it was like 30-something tracks, but only like 47 minutes, and I was like, what the fuck is this actually? Hey man, I like my music to be fun sometimes, and this is a type of fun that has artful chops below it that I can really admire as somebody who likes some of the recipe that Skrillex has been cooking with. Do I like every piece of this puzzle? No. But I think that the ratio on here is more entertaining than not and makes for a listen that you can't say isn't engaging because it is pulling you from each idea to the next. It also just does so seamlessly that makes for the type of album experience where it feels lost without any one piece. More so than I think most lull ironic records can be. But I'm giving this an 8 out of 10. I really like this album. I think that it's a fun record, and I think that it's, like, really cool to see Skrillex both being ironic, but, like, caring of what he's being ironic about in the same breath. Really fun release. Glad he dropped it. Choice shit. You know, at first glance, I like a lot of the ideas within this new Mars Volta album, Lucro, Sucrio, Los Ojos del Vacio. You know, a band who's good at these big concepts like the Mars Volta, dropping this Phantom release that they debuted by playing live, opening for the Deftones, with these nuggets of mystery and intrigue being planted in such small doses by the band themselves. Sounds like a recipe for success, and there's a real emptiness in the lyrics on pockets of this that really help sort of lend to the title and the cover art having this blankness, and that I think weaves together for a solid project. There's just some components from the band's sounds and identity that I kind of wish had a bigger showcasing on here. I was a pretty adamant defender of their self-titled return a couple years back. I still think it's a really solid album by the band that saw them softening maybe their drive, but not necessarily dulling their shine, so to speak. And parts of this still have that. Like the little 4-piece stretch from the opener, Finn through Miklan, almost evoke the feeling of like passing on through their psychedelic prog eyes that feel like expansions from that self-titled that I think culminate to a really good moment that I think starts the record off strongly. I really love the groove that they reach on En las Tinieblas. I think that like there's a nugget there that almost feels like offshoots and sort of like bringing in components of records like Amputexture into the soundscape that they're really trying to build off from in this relaunch. I think the Iron Rose following that is sort of the first glimpse at some of the problems I have with the album. I think that it is a fine enough song, but I don't think that as like a hook-driven song, it's their strongest in that lane. Sure, it acts as a moment to sort of bring the pain and sorrow of loss back to the world, or back to Earth, so to speak, but I don't think that it necessarily is the best version of that idea, so to speak. I do think that it's sort of sandwiched between two great moments, though, because the first stretch of this album I think is really, really strong. I think Cue the Sun and Alba de la Rate is a cool planting moment that sees them, again, kind of getting Volta with it, with how, especially Alba de la Rate's sort of evolution of its groove gets a little more wonky and sort of feels like something that could be seen on like Bedlam and Goliath. It also acts as a moment where it sort of feels like we get a taste for the world as Cedric sees it. It's a very bleak feeling that permeates throughout those two tracks, which makes the sort of point of it coming back at the end feel all the more pertinent. It's a point where the mood of death and loss feels all the more real, and I like that about it. I think that it's a good moment to kind of shake the listener in a subtle sort of way, but in the same breath, that subtlety is this record's biggest crux, in my opinion. You know, I think that, the album continues to go strongly immediately after that with Voices in My Knives and Poseidora de mi Sombra being a cool sort of like slow burn moment that culminates to a lot of the fun play that I've loved from that self-titled, and as a moment from that self-titled when it comes to like an embracing of, Latin jazz that I love to see them do, and I think that when they craft a moment like this, it just fucking works. The atmosphere and vibes are a lot more lax, but it still retains the mood of the album. It just fits the vibe and carries the listener in a wistful, but still kind of uneasy sort of way. But when getting into the next stretch of the record is where like a lot of the more problems I have with the pacing of this record sort of come to light. For as much as I like the glimpses into the character of what this band has been thus far in their career, even with the sort of like the further smoothening that was present on the last album, there's not enough real brightness to keep the listener sort of in the pocket, so to speak. Sure, there's some fun grooves and there's some nice use of space, Like, the production on Un Disparo al Vazio is really cool. I love the use of electronics on that song, and it sort of feels like a more uneasy forward track that I think is sort of, especially where it crops up in the record, felt very needed. But it's following moments like Vocifero and one of the handful of just feels like pointless interludes of Miro de los Trece Celios. I just don't think add much to the tapestry, so to speak. You know, for a band that really can go the distance with a sound, and I've seen them do these great cocktails of prog madness and Latin-inspired jams, I just don't think that this is the best cocktail with that recipe. It doesn't go quite far enough for my liking anyway. I do like a lot of the themes. It feels like they're really trying to give the listener a perspective that I feel like a lot of people are missing when it comes to like a global sense. I just think that there's like a pocket, especially in the back half, where it really starts to kind of lose its luster. It picks itself back up by the end, especially when that Cue the Sun reprise comes in, that I think gets carried out in grand splendor with Lucro Sucrio. A moment where, honestly, a lot of the ideas I feel like the band was trying to cook actually culminate to a fantastic moment, but the journey there is just a bit more dodgy than I was hoping. It leaves me kind of torn and conflicted, because the album also just flows so wonderfully. Weaving track to track, just like, it creates this portrait that I do think is interesting to some degree, but I just wish went a little harder. So I'm kind of left wanting to give this a 6, if not a 7. Like, I'm in that kind of realm. I think that it is solid. It's still a very solid album. I just wanted more out of it, you know what I mean?
I'ma burn a bridge just to let you know I said it. Yeah, I'm unapologetic, saying what I said just to...
Mayday's first album, post Strange Music, Just Us, has the themes and feeling of a breakup album, and I think that that feels pretty apt. But I think that the energy has this drive for a new horizon that I admire as this album leaves the rear view. You know, it does have this sort of sadness and very much like almost angst towards the B in this A-B conversation, so to speak, with Just Us and Black Lemonade, even in Unapologetic, really forming this feeling that, you know, things were kind of a rough separation, so to speak. But I think that, like, that attitude also provides a nice bite early on in the album to hook the listener in. You know, while I don't think Black Lemonade is my favorite hook-driven song the group has written, I think Unapologetic after that is a stronger sort of uppercut moment that I think gives way to Acting Grown, a moment of real self-reflection, pretty solidly. You know, while the album is full of some, like, really wild sort of like outro sample choices to carry the listener from song to song, the Apparently Kid being on this album is honestly a really nice brand of hilarious that I kind of needed. Acting Grown is, again, not my favorite laid-back jam the band has written, but I think that, like, as far as still showcasing one's abilities to craft a hook in your own new world-building lane, it's not that bad in the same breath. I think that the chemistry of Benz and Recognize honestly feels stronger than ever throughout parts of this. You know, and I'm really happy to see that. These guys really do feel like they're rejuvenated on the other side of this album, and for a guy who did get into them through their last era, I'm at least glad that this is a solid sort of rebirth of sorts for them. You know, and that combative nature doesn't necessarily feel lost throughout that rebirth. They definitely feel reaffirmed. You know, Unapologetic may give way to Acting Grown, but Misinformed after that almost feels like a thread that gets followed through on I Don't Want to Know later on in the album, in the form of, like, speaking against social lies or, like, falling within the back and forth, so to speak, of the drama. But even in that sense, the album doesn't, you know, end on that confrontation. It sort of brings it back around with Ceilings after I Don't Want to Know. I will say, for as much as I admire all of that, even in that same breath, I Don't Want to Know isn't amongst my favorite songs on the album, and it kind of is at the end of a pocket that I don't necessarily like, because I don't really dig Ain't For Them as much. They've done other sort of like I'm the best type jams better than this. By the by, this is still a very solid ass pop leaning album that if you enjoyed the sort of escapades that Recognize Benz and the guys have been doing through Strange, and you want to see them sort of reacclimate into a new world, Justus isn't a bad place to go for them. I think this is a 6 out of 10 record. It's honestly really, really solid. It's produced really nicely. The band is still tight as fuck. While I don't necessarily love all of the instrumental palettes, I think that like when the band locks in and creates a really good groove, it excels. I do think that a lot of the hooks are relatively solid. And again, the chemistry is still just potent here in ways that I'm glad to see not dulled with these guys. Well, I've still yet to dive into the middle of this band's career that I've missed out on. I really enjoyed Sleigh Bell's last album, Texas. I thought it was a nice reintroduction to the band for me, and I was happy to see a band known for making very big, noisy pop smashes. Still, we're doing it pretty consistently. And if anything, Bunky Becky Birthday Boy only reaffirms those strengths, and in some instances, I would say goes more bold with them consistently. I absolutely love the sounds on this album. The synth sounds on Bunky Bop, which just starts the record off with some hype shit, carries that hype through moments that honestly showcase things that I wish other bands kind of cribbed off of a little bit. You know, when you want to make a stomping 70s, 80s inspired rock jam, want to start a band is the archetype that you should be aiming for with your production. I love the drums on that song. And I love that that gives way to just some wonky synth offshoots in the vein of Life Was Real and Roxette Rick, which reins some of those oddities in to this really nice, still sharp groove of a almost ballad-esque moment, or this album's version of it. And when it comes to still having that ear for melody and hook crafting, that's still showcased on here as well, throughout the veins of the very bright This Summer. When the hook gives way on Can I Scream, it creates this almost anticlimax that gives the listener this hook to dance in under the uneasy groove. I really love the atmosphere of this record. For as brief as it is, it's very in and out, but it knows what it wants to accomplish. It accomplishes it in spades, in my opinion. The backdrop of Blasted Shadow is giving like Sonic the Hedgehog level melting before your eyes, but I absolutely love that about it. Sleigh Bells are just a group that know their niche and are just absolutely thriving in it. Something else that I will say about a couple of other acts that I talked about this month. But this is a really strong album. I like it more than Texas, honestly, and I thought Texas was a fucking blast. I'm giving this an 8 out of 10. I absolutely adore this thing. I think if you love Sleigh Bells and you still haven't really checked back into them, or if you get nostalgic for Sleigh Bells and you're like, what are they doing now? You'll be happy to know they're still doing some great shit, in my opinion.
What you said, I tried to take the word, but the word was dead.
All I needed to know was that Black Country New Road were still going on for me to be hyped for this new album, Forever How Long. I absolutely love the musicians in this band and knew that if any band were to bounce back after like the leaving of a singer who helped kind of carry the mood of the band, it would be them. And that's because, especially with Ants From Up Here, they proved that they can set a stage. They could build a sonic world. You know, while I liked the emotional intimacy sonically that was sort of like felt throughout the debut, I thought that like the heights they reached really showcased that they are like just that good at what they do. Which they do the smart thing on this transitional record sonically, and that's keep the vocalizing in-house. With Tyler Hyde, Georgia Ellery, and May Kershaw stepping in on various points in the record. It also lends to some great moments in the sequencing, given what songs they place where, and when each vocalist has their own point in the track listing to add some to the emotional tapestry that's going on lyrically. The journey across this album is as interesting as the world built on Ants From Up Here, because it has those moments of emotional intimacy still felt. Like, Socks absolutely feels kind of like a very snapshot look that I've loved about output from the band in the past, just done in a different light. You know, the sonic palette of this feels bright, like Besties and Happy Birthday, but even the mood of a track like Happy Birthday and the emotional forlorning on Besties feels like this band incarnate. I absolutely love the wistful energy on a track like The Big Spin. It's a track about being pent up and locked away, and those pensive energies feel channeled wonderfully on there. That same energy coming out on the back half of Nancy Tries to Take the Night. When the band comes in and that groove gets locked, it is a choice fucking moment. I also love that even if the album does lean more into more bright, vibrant sounds, they do have this moment where, like, and, you know, looking into the record, it sort of feels like that was sort of the point where...
A moment where the group sort of... true harmony is fully reached, is seen in a sort of middle portion throughout Salem Sisters, a point where all three vocalists coalesce together and create, you know, a sense of beauty across the groove that the band is locked in once again. Absolute highlight on the record, and another choice selection that, again, it feels like the spirit of the band was never lost, even if it may feel ever so different now. That point also transitions into a sequence in the record where the sort of emotional familiarity that fans of the band may be craving at this point sort of creeps back out with the more solemn Two Horses and Mary, two beautiful tracks in their own regard that I think add some real, you know, grounded sadness around these fantastical whimsy that the album's been sort of thralling around in so far.
But I also think that this album really closes itself out with the same kind of character that I would expect from this band, just in a new world. And that's one of the best takeaways I can have with this release, is that it is still very much the spirit of this group, and I figured that wasn't going to go away. I just love how they've evolved it across this record, you know, adding almost a sort of layer to their mood that I enjoy, you know, especially on some of the sounds on the title track. I love the way that the group pairs their instruments with George's voice, like the woodwinds on that, or the sax on Salem Sisters. I just really enjoy a lot of the sounds in this record, and I'm glad to see this band still making great shit. I like this a lot. I want to give this a 9. I like a lot of the energy on this. I like a lot of the lyrical tapestries. It still has a lot of what I love in this band. And I love seeing that even in a different spirit, the heart is still there through and through.
Blue and gold, Friday night. Team up with Charlie, take these kids.
One album I figured I would still keep parts of, but honestly still revisit in full a couple years down the road is Joe's Decide, the album that got me into Joe Keery's musical endeavors. I really like the sounds on it, and I think that when he makes a hook, he can really sell it well. And I like his sort of menagerie of influences he was sort of bringing together, even if he did lean on them a little too heavily, and instances of that. However, I think on its follow-up, The Crux, he's found a good way to really go further into adding his own personal twist on his inspirations and creating a more cohesive listen out of the record that I think is a bit stronger and elevated from Decide. And maybe it's because he swapped his more Kevin Parker influence with a Julian Casablancas influence in some moments, like the fantastic opener, Lonesome Is a State of Mind, which feels like the blendings of the strengths of a group like The Strokes and Cake in this weird opener that I think sets a mood that Joe really sort of continues to adapt with across the runtime. You know, there's still a Talking Heads influence felt on a track like Basic Being Basic, but it feels less on the nose than it did on a track like Gloom from his last album. I really enjoy the evolution he showcases on here, by the by. And Basic Being Basic is a great, similarly to Gloom, like, punch into a different type of groove, but I think sticks the landing just as strongly as that. There's also a further cleaning up of sound in the production that I think lets some of the bigger hook-driven ideas and gives a sense of scope to some of the isolated feelings and enriches those ideas just as well, which happens throughout the sort of middle portion of the record of like Potion through Egg. You know, Potion is this clean acoustic guitar, you know, driven song that is catchy as hell and gives way to this nice funky Delicia. Both very, you know, hook driven songs, but with different flavors that pair well together and sort of still feel like expansions on the very 80s-ish inspired realms that Joe feels like he's channeling in his sonic palette, so to speak. But, like, Egg is a moment that I think takes itself to the next level. You know, I love the build-up amidst the sparseness of the song. It's a moment where, like, Joe feels like he's really putting his vulnerable, isolated feelings on a more earnest step. And I love the point that song builds to. It still feels in line with that, like, 80s-inspired jam, but it's an album-cut-ass song from a guy whose, like, last album had some of that, but not quite like what's on this. And that cleanness also helps elevate some other elements, like the rock edge on Gap Tooth Smile, which helps add some, you know, bite to the backstretch of the record. I think this album is pretty damn good. I figured I was going to like it to some degree, considering how much of a grower I think Decide is, but I like this thing off the rip. I think it's choice. I think it's got more. It's a little bit more of a fruitful release, which is what I was hoping for from him following Decide. He didn't really disappoint. I'm giving this an 8 out of 10. This thing is strong as hell. I absolutely recommend.
So I try to be smarter, letting go of pointless remedies.
For as much as I loved their debut, Honeymoon, back in 2020, I don't spin
Beach Bunny all that often. In fact, I missed the album between this newest one, Tunnel Vision, and that, and I kind of need to go back and spin that.
However, having Tunnel Vision, their newest album, healthily in my rotation as the month was winding to an end, I kind of found myself kicking myself in the ass for one, skipping on the album between these two, but also just not keeping them more present in my mind, because similarly to Honeymoon, if not more so, I think this is a healthy batch of really infectious, pop-driven, rock, sort of pop-punk-inspired tunes. If anything, it feels like these guys should be more popular especially considering avenues of pop paved out through artists like Olivia Rodrigo. Like, their style could really do numbers, so to speak. I also think similarly to Honeymoon, there is a strong emotional core to this that is elevated by some of the hook writing on here. I mean, the two-piece of Chasm and the title track early on in the album's runtime really have these great displays of, you know, personal growth and conflictions and finding one's own inner self torn with such infectiousness that is just really well crafted. The title track in particular feels like this just great bending of rhythm with hook that I think leads to a fun groove, which I think pairs well with some of those more pop-punk inspired jams like Chasm and Pixie Cut, which I think Pixie Cut is a good showcasing of the more simple but still just well-crafted hook spinning that's also seen on tracks like Mr. Predictable or on Vertigo, which is another fucking smash. I really love this record front to back. It's a breezy, catchy listen that I think if you love pop music in particular and you admire and you really adore a pretty good hook, there's a lot of them on here that have some fun rock burgeonings also popping up beneath them. Can't get enough of this thing. Thing fucking rips. Is an 8 out of 10 for sure, and easily one of the strongest it's laying up for this year.
Oh no, it's not the same.
Judging by general consensus online, I was unaware that I was in a minority for liking Sunflower Beans' Head Full of Sugar, an album that saw them adorning some more synth-laden atmospheres that I think were an interesting pivot for them to make. And I thought stuck the landing really strongly. With their newest album, Mortal Primetime, we do see them sort of skirting back into more familiar territories. This album more sounds like the album that got me into them, 22 in Blue, from 2018. Not Not to say that that's a bad thing. One of the things I will say that I admire about this is that while it is sort of a pivot back into relatively familiar territories, they do utilize atmosphere just as well, even if it is a bit more lavish and lush in moments, as opposed to some of the gritty synth grooves that coated the previous album. They also have this really nice A and B sort of progression with the lyrics. You know, there's a real lustful passion that gives way to longful yearning in a sense of like real wrongdoing across the journey between these two passionate lovers that seemingly goes asunder. You know, I'll get it out of the way. I don't know if I necessarily like the atmosphere and sounds themselves as much as Head Full of Sugar, even if that is maybe a hot take. But I do still love what the band are doing here. You know, the opener, Champagne Taste, really more feels like they're sort of embracing of some of the rock ideas that were on King of the Dudes, an EP that I think is still very slept on by rock fans. I love the immediate groove and how it thrusts the listener into the lust between these two. You know, even if it only takes a couple tracks for things to get more forlorn and solemn, like on Waiting for the Rain, they do have this nice dazzling opener with Nothing Romantic sort of doubling down on that lust in some nice ways that I think do sit in the realms of some of the ideas from their last album, so it's a nice sort of like easing in if you were really fucking with the vibes from then, but I think also introduce a lot more of the world of sounds the band does still utilize very well. They sound fantastic on this as far as being a core unit goes. I still love the trading of vocals. You know, it helps drive that A and B conversation especially. Like, look what you've done to me, following some of the grandiosity within Waiting for the Rain, which has this great layered vocal chorus that really helps send some of that loneliness over the moon as the bass washes in. I also love the dramatics behind There's a Part I Can't Get Back. It has that real crying amongst the stars feel to it that sort of that feels like it's sort of looking at that lust in such a bittersweet way that I think helps sort of carry the chasm between these two into its resting place, because the last couple of stretches really present not only like the other side, but just sort of round the whole story of these two up just a few tracks down the line. All that's to say that there's a lot of really good stuff here, and I think that as far as like the band evolving their sound, I think that they could have easily done really a menagerie of things, but I think that this is a solid venture into it. There's some moments that I don't necessarily like. While I really enjoy the two closers, Shooting Star and Sunshine, I think that like the size of the drone on Sunshine really creates this interesting portrait that they sort of close the record out on. But having Please Rewind amidst this final stretch is just a moment that I don't think shines as bright as the rest, while presenting, maybe in the scope of the record, the other side of the conversations, like real internal misery missing the person that's here and wishing they could go back, and it creates an interesting dichotomy. I just don't think that the acoustic-driven moments on here are the moments where the record shines. I also don't really like I Knew Love as much. I think that as far as being a part of the record, it still makes sense. You know, I think it's an interesting sort of, again, juxtaposition from Take Out Your Insides, which feels like being caught in one's own misery loop, and a great moment in the record. Those are just a couple of moments that I don't think are as strong as other moments on the album that I think are absolutely fantastic. It's overall a really solid release that I think maybe not be their best album, or maybe even the best like starting point getting into the band. But I mean, I think if you're looking for something that's got a good use of sonic identity, or a good sort of like harnessing of one's own idiosyncrasies, even if you weren't aware that they are that, you've got worse albums from bands. This is a solid 7 out of 10 release. You know, it's definitely got some cool vibes and some good production that backs a lot of that, but I wouldn't say that every moment shines quite that brightly.
I should have known
I'm gonna kind of crib something from my buddy Mark from Fully Involved in regards to how I feel with this new Ghost album, Skeleta. It sort of further cements a point that I've sort of been stewing with myself since my absolute disdain for their last album, Impera. And that's just that I don't think that I really dig the direction this band is going towards. I can respect what they're doing from a lyrical perspective. I can understand not wanting to always be known as the culty Satan rock band. I also don't think that they sort of broaden their lyrical tapestry to anywhere that feels too far off from their roots when it comes to like a broader sense. You know, Impera talking about empires and the like could be sort of comparable to talking about something as big as theology or Satanism, as they was mostly their calling card. Which with Skeleta, that sort of still remains the point. While not necessarily as big, it feels a little more personal. The sounds and some of the ideas within talking about sort of people and sort of their core still reach the grandiosity that they were very much still known for. The thing is, I just don't like the sound that they're doing anymore. You know, while I didn't necessarily love the last album that sort of felt within their realms, Prequel, I at least dug the melding of sonics and lyrics and felt like they were a nice sort of interesting tangent within their world. Impera's lyrics may have sort of felt on brand, but I don't think they gelled well with their, like, late stage glam metal, Power Rangers-ass sounds they were cooking on there, and I don't think that they blended well with the brands of theatrics they were still trying to throw at the wall era from where they left us with Prequel. On Skeleta, they do sort of drop a lot of the overt grand theatrics. You know, they still have a big scope to the sound of this, and it feels very much like it's growing from Impera. It also just kind of feels reined in ways that I think make for a better album, admittedly. I just don't still really love it as much as I have records of theirs in the past, like, you know, obviously Meliora and Infestus Sumum and the like. I will say, I think that the times that the theatrics crop up on here really remind me of Infestus Sumum in particular, but without some of the other ideas, like what they were doing on the sonics of that record. It makes for a little more of a bland experience on Skeleta, which was ultimately my problem with the glam metal stuff from Impera. You know, it didn't really fit the vibe of what I really liked from them anyway, but like, while the production still sounds fine enough, I just don't like these guys doing that stuff. I just don't think they do it well. They don't do it interestingly, in my opinion. That's not to say that I hate every song that's on here, though, because there are a couple of solid jams that I think make for a sort of nice tangent and add to the sort of macabre vibe that I also dig from these guys. Like, the pairing of Lacrima and Satanized make for a nice little nugget early on in the album that sort of carries the torch from Peacefield, but I don't think Peacefield's my favorite opener they've ever done. But also, De Profundis Borealis also just kind of feels like a trademark sort of update to the Ghost formula sonically, but I think that it reaches a solid place with me. I think that it's a nice, big, booming jam that does still tap into that Power Rangers-ass sound, but it sounds nicely put together on there, and sort of feels like it's gelling with the identity of the band, better than, like, the balladry on Guiding Lights, or what they're trying to do on the March of Miscilla Amori. They also definitely feel like they're more just kind of, like, keeping their brand a little more in place here. Because, I mean, they have Satanized, a track that I do think is one of the better, again, sort of heavier-leaning cuts. But they've also got Mark of the Evil One later on in the album to try and be this other big, gaudy rock song. But that song really kind of reminds me of what I didn't like about Prequel. It's a solid jam, I'll give it that, and I think that its hook of Dare, Dare isn't, like, the worst, but again, it evokes the same kind of, like, thing I didn't like about songs like Rats. This album is a step up from their last one, but again, I just think it's a point where, like, I don't know if I am going to like anything this band does holistically from here. I'm giving this a 5 because I don't think that it's like bad or like poorly sort of cobbled together as I thought Impera was. It's just like painfully mediocre, which is sort of the worst thing you could become when you were once like the kooky Satan band, I guess. One album I wanted to talk about in March because I was very excited for it and wanted to sort of give it its due credits earlier in the year. The new Japanese Breakfast album for Melancholy, Brunettes, and Sad Women is a record I knew I was going to have to talk about in April if I didn't talk about it in March. And I didn't really spend much time with it or as much time as I would have liked around the end of the month. It was a late in the month release. But I mean, considering how far pushed back I made the listening log for April, you knew I was going to talk about it. The big reason why I wanted to talk about it more poignantly is because I think that sonically, it is a great sort of transition into spring. It is it is a very cold album by the by. It matches the melancholy atmosphere, the sadness that Michelle Zauer really taps into lyrically on here. That is this nice seed of betrayal, but branches out into broader observations and issues seen within men in the men community that I think is pulled together very eloquently. But sonically, it has this nice blossoming out also that I think feels very indicative of the springtime. You know, the intimacy can be felt throughout Here Is Someone that crescendos really well into Orlando Is Love that I think strikes into that sort of emotional heart and sets the stage very aptly. You know, I really love the acoustic atmosphere that those songs really build with, but there's a real elegance that is imbued throughout, especially Orlando Is Love. I absolutely adore the horizons that song sonically reaches, and I think that like it is a great early album invigorator. Admittedly, Honey Water isn't my favorite piece of the early album, but I think that like Mega Circuit after it retains the sort of march that song was driving with and pivots it into a really good groove. I think that there's a true sadness that happens after that with the one song that I think really helps welcome in the more springtime atmosphere with the middle piece Little Girl, a song that has this sort of accepted kind of sadness in its lyrics. It's a song that through some of the lyrics feels inspired by like a dad missing his daughter, and it's a well articulated but very approachable and simple, like not infectious, approachable and catchy sort of song that weaves together this delicate atmosphere that I think out of the crescendos on the album, it has this warmth to its production that it sort of helps bring in that spring energy I was sort of talking about. It's a really good middle piece. That sort of energy only getting enriched, especially once tracks like a Picture Window and Men in Bars, which is a collaboration with Jeff Bridges that I think is great. A fantastic ballad that I think lyrically creates this really good back and forth for this adulterous relationship that the album sort of has going on as its narrative, so to speak, or the seeds that I sort of talked about earlier. And helps tie the whole record together after it sort of branches out for a couple of songs. But Picture Window in it also more bring in this country-inspired sound.
While importing my footage, I was reading sort of the consensus on the records that I was reviewing this month, like I do from time to time, and Mark from Spectrum Pulse kind of made the most apt comparison in that it feels very Mitski-inspired, and like it does have moments where, especially when it comes to some of the atmosphere and the hooks that feel indicative of where like Mitski was at in like the transition into the 2020s, but I think that like what Michelle does to like add her own sense of atmosphere to some of that country inspiration just creates something all its own that I absolutely adore.
The Sonics are a bit more bright. You know, they still have this obviously melancholy edge, but like the production and the warmth just lends to a little more of a vibrant flourishing out that sort of feels like the album leads into a rebirth through Women in LA and Magic Mountain especially, where one of these sides of this relationship feels reborn. And it's a great moment for the album to reach. I honestly really enjoy this album. I think that if you like records that lean into a real emotional weight, and honestly have some great sort of just tongue-in-cheek lines scattered throughout that really add personality to the emotion driving the album. This is a great record. While it's not as cold as it was even in April, this is still a great album if you're ever wanting something to throw on in the springtime to get yourself out of the potential winter sadness. 8 out of 10. Maybe even more the more that I sit with this, but like over the last month I've been teetering on an 8 or 9. I really like this album. I think it is fantastic. Another one of my personal favorites in the year so far that is absolutely worth your time. And those were the albums I listened to. Do you agree with my thoughts? Do you disagree? Let me know your thoughts on any albums you'd like for me to talk about in this segment in the comments down below. Once again, if you didn't like, give it a like. If you want to see more, consider subscribing. I drop 2 to 4 vids a week depending on what I've got going on. I do plan on having some fun things drop this week along with the finale of Yu-Gi-Oh! Dropping this weekend. But if you do want to see something else I'm cooking a little bit sooner on my second channel later on today, I will be dropping the next piece of a playthrough of Oddworld Stranger's Wrath that I've been doing my first playthrough nonetheless. But either way, I'm going to go. Thank you again so very much for watching this. I've been Viral Rack. You guys have a good day's lots of situations, and I'll see you another day.
Woken by the smell of sorted power and defecting shortly after. Fist bump, dry land, blackish. Cat